It is wonderful to be back with you. And it's a fortuitous day because this just happens to be the feast in which, in the Christian tradition, Francis of Assisi, his life is celebrated today. And although he was a Christian, he is really known by many peoples and in many cultures of the world as a great model for his love for the poor, for his love for peace, and for a commitment to protecting the environment, nature. Confucius always taught in China, when he taught his students, that we should learn from the wisdom of the past, but adapt it creatively to the present. We can't be slaves of the past, but we can take the wisdom of the past and in a creative way adopt it to a world that is ever-changing. Now, I would like to follow Confucius's advice this morning by explaining some of the wisdom of Francis of Assisi, who lived 900 years ago, and show how Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Argentina, Pope Francis, is creatively applying the wisdom of the original Francis to his leadership style today in the Catholic Church and for all people. Francesco of Assisi, that was his name. This first Francesco, was born in Assisi, Italy at the end of the 12th century, 1181, to wealthy parents. His mother was a French noblewoman, and his father was a very successful Italian cloth merchant with great admiration for the French. In fact, although one of his 7 children was baptized Giovanni, or John, the father preferred to call him Francesco because his father was traveling in France on business when Giovanni was born. Francesco grew up in a very comfortable family. He had a very carefree life, never lacked anything. And he began working for his father as a young man by selling cloth and velvet in the marketplace in Assisi, and spending a lot of time with his friends, having a great time. One day, a beggar approached Francesco for alms as he was selling goods in the marketplace. Something, whatever it was, kind of touched his heart, and he emptied all his pockets and gave all the money that he had to the beggar. When his friends found out about it, they laughed at him and mocked him and said, "What are you doing?" And then when his father found out about it, he scolded him. Then he decided he wanted to be a soldier. That's how he was going to get fame and glory. And so at the age of 20, he went off to fight with Assisi's army against the neighboring city-state of Perugia. He was captured, and he lived as a prisoner in exile for a year. When he returned to Assisi, he contracted a very serious illness, which debilitated him for many months, and he had a lot of time to think. These setbacks gave him the opportunity to experience life from the other side and to do some reflecting about it. When his health finally returned, he was thinking and acting in a bit different way. He didn't want to return to the carefree style that he once had. So he started to pray a lot. And one day, in an old broken-down church, he thought he heard the voice of God that said, "Francesco, go and repair my house, which you can see is falling into ruins." Francesco interpreted the call literally. And so what he did was he went to his father's warehouse, took a lot of the fine cloth and velvet, sold it, and then hired workers to go and repair the old church. Well, now this time his father became furious. And he dragged him before the local bishop. Many times bishops in the Middle Ages were judges. So he dragged him out in the marketplace and asked the bishop to come to judge this young man who had stolen from him. Francis repented. He promised to pay back his father what he had taken. And then he stripped off every bit of clothing, became naked, handed the clothing to his father, and he said, "Thus far I have served you, my father on earth. Henceforth I will serve my father in heaven." The embarrassed bishop became so flustered he just grabbed a cloak from a poor beggar and he threw it on the nakedness of Francis. And from then on, Francis wore the cloak of a beggar. He began to help with the leper communities outside the city. He would go and bathe them. He would give them food. Then he went to Rome and stood in front of churches in Rome, which was a more wealthy city, to beg for food and money in Rome. And then he went out in the countryside and used that money to repair churches. So he's kind of following this literal voice, repair my church. But as his life among the poor began to change the way he interpreted the voice. He now felt that perhaps that voice was a little more subtle and a little more demanding, because he began to feel that the whole church that he knew in Italy needed reform. The bishops were living in absolute luxury, and there was neglect of the poor. That's why there were beggars on the street. And so living poorly with the poor changed the way he viewed the world. As an aside, Karl Marx is right. Where we live in our material conditions does affect the way we think. And his association with the poor opened him up to a new way of thinking about the call of God. And one day, when he was in a church, he heard a sermon about Jesus' sending out of his first disciples to preach, where he says, go and preach the good news, and don't take with you an extra set of clothing. Don't take any money with you. Travel poorly. And that very much impressed Francis. And from then on, he began to go out and preach the gospel to the poor, continued to live simply, and he began to attract other young men, that some of them who knew him, who were attracted by his commitment, and some women. So he began to set up communities of men and women living in common life together, who would serve the poor and who would preach the gospel. In the year 1210, his bishop, who was very impressed with him, accompanied him to Rome to see Pope Innocent III, who was one of the most powerful popes in the Middle Ages. And Francis went before the Pope and he said, here are my rules for a new religious community to serve the church. This community will live a common life, share its property, men and women living separate in community lives, but they will serve the poor. We must bring the church back to serving the poor. Now, the Pope didn't want to listen to him. The Pope was living in quite a luxurious palace himself. But the Bishop of Assisi said, no, listen to this man. We really should listen to him. So the Pope relented, gave him permission, and then he went out with his approval and founded what's called the Order of Friars Minor, the Franciscans. And for the rest of his 14 years on earth, he worked among the poor, founded many convents and monasteries of men and women living with the poor and going out to bring them not only spiritual assistance, but material assistance as well, healing the body and the soul together. He also became very concerned about the violence that the Crusades were unleashing in the world. And he knew there were successive armies going to the Middle East, many of them coming back wounded and in terrible condition. And he prayed very hard for peace. He felt that whatever reasons the war was going on, it should stop. And so he decided personally to do something about it. So in 1219, he went to Egypt, where one of the major battles was being waged on the Nile between Christians and Muslims. And it was at a place called Damietta. And he went to the Crusaders because he wanted to convince them to lay down their arms and to be at peace. And what he found was murderers, rapists, people who hated other people, people who were in the Crusades in order to get money and to rob. And he found out that one of the previous Crusades had gone through Constantinople on its way to the Holy Land and had sacked the beautiful Christian cathedral of Sancta Sophia, Holy Wisdom, took the gold from fellow Christians and put a prostitute on the altar. He was absolutely disgusted with what he saw in terms of Christians fighting for a Christian cause. So he decided he'd try the other side. And there was a 4-week truce in the battle. And so he went to the other side and asked to see the Sultan, Sultan Malik al-Kamil, who was I think he was the son or grandson of Saladin, the great Sultan in the previous crusade. And the Sultan received him. And they spent 4 days talking. Francis's goal was, I would like to convert him to Christianity, so then he would become a peaceful man. Not like the Crusaders. He wanted to talk about the Christianity of Jesus. The Sultan wanted to convert him to Islam. So the conversation started with each making the case to the other, and they both agreed to disagree. But they then began to converse about what each of the religions had in common, because so much of Islam takes the teachings from the Jewish tradition and from the Christian tradition. And so what they found out when they started talking about what they believe respectively, they found out that Islam and Christianity in its original meaning is to be concerned about the poor. Both religions respect Jesus as a great prophet. The Muslims don't consider him divine, but they mention him 43 times in the Quran. They believe he will come back to judge the world, not Muhammad. And so Francis was really astounded as he began to learn these things. And as he talked about the war, he was very impressed to hear that the Sultan said, we are fighting a defensive war. You people have come to attack us. And we believe we have the right to defend ourselves. And when your soldiers surrender, we do try to treat them with great respect. So Francis was very impressed by this conversation. And like the two foxes in the story, they decided it was better not to be like the rest of people, but to remain as they are, as friends with respect, but not to fight. And so Francis left, and he went back, and when he went back to Assisi, he always spoke with great respect for the Muslims. He brought back with him a gift from the Sultan, I think it's called a muezzin. It's what they used to call people to prayer. And he would use that in Assisi in calling people to prayer. And apparently one of the advisors of the Sultan was so impressed in listening to this conversation that he had a picture of Francis made for him, and then it was put on his tombstone. The Sultan, in turn, continued to be very gracious to crusaders who surrendered. And when the Crusades were over, the only Christian group from the West that was allowed to come and take care of the holy places, the Christian places, was the Franciscan order. Francesco also had a great passion for nature. His mystical experiences in prayer moved him to see God's presence in the beauty of all creation. He wrote a beautiful hymn called Canticle of Creatures, wherein he referred to Brother Sun and Sister Moon. He denounced disrespect for nature as a serious sin. And he believed, as do Buddhists, that all life on the planet is interrelated in a deep spiritual bond. Legend has it that he even used to preach to the birds. And his voice was so soft and gentle, the birds would kind of come and sit on his shoulder. And he would preach to them about God's love. And there's another legend that one day a very hungry wolf was attacking a small village and killing small children because the wolf was hungry. And that Francis went up into the hills and saw the wolf and put his hand out in friendship and brought the wolf back to the village and said, "Please feed him, he's hungry." And the village fed him and the wolf stopped attacking. Now these are legends, okay? Now, I don't know what the basis of those two stories. The other things I've told you are actual fact. But as you can imagine, with great figures, legends build up, and sometimes there is a kernel of the story, but then they get exaggerated. In 1979, during his first year of papacy, John Paul II declared Francesco the patron saint of ecology. Now, the second Francis. Confucius would just smile today were he able to observe the life and example of Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Argentina, who has creatively applied the wisdom of Francesco to his life and to his leadership style in the Catholic Church, Pope Francis. Bergoglio's parents migrated from Italy to Argentina in the early 20th century. His father worked on the railroad, and they lived a very difficult life, didn't have much money. He was born in 1936, and they lived in a working-class area of Buenos Aires. Like Francesco, Bergoglio had health problems as a young man. He lost one lung as a teenager due to a respiratory illness. He entered the Jesuit seminary in Argentina in 1958. The same year I entered the Jesuit seminary in New York, having finished a university degree majoring in chemistry. So he was trained as a scientist. After ordination to the priesthood in 1970, he taught at Jesuit high schools in Buenos Aires that were offering scholarships to the poor, because it was after Vatican II and the Catholic Church was beginning to try to do more for the poor in developing countries. So he had a lot of poor kids that he taught. And he was chosen head of the Jesuit order in Argentina in 1973. So he became the superior of all the Jesuits in Argentina in 1973. 3 years later, a tragedy happened. The military seized power in the country due to a lot of chaos that was going on. But then for the next 7 years, they carried out an absolute reign of terror, killing a lot of young people whom they suspected were infected with Marxist ideas. They didn't wait to find out. They just arrested these people, tortured them, and then dropped them from helicopters into the Atlantic Ocean. One of the only places people could come for help were the churches. And so what Bergoglio did was, many of the kids he had taught in high school, who were now in university, would come to him and say, I'm in trouble. So he would hide them. He would take them into his residence, or he would take them to a convent if it was a woman, or a rectory if it was a young man. He'd hide them. He would make contacts with his family, and he still had family in Italy. He'd make contacts. He'd be very careful of what he said on the phone or in any kind of a telegram. But a friend of mine is coming on such and such a flight from Brazil next week. Would you please meet them? And then what he would do is quietly drive them in his car. Sometimes he'd dress them up as a nun or a priest and take him to the border. And there'd be somebody from Brazil. He had contacted the Jesuits in Brazil, and they would take him to the airport, and off they'd go. He saved over 100 people that way. And many of them were non-Christians or former Christians. And he never asked any questions about you. Who are you? What's your background? What's your sexual orientation? He just took them. And right under the nose of the military. There's a book that's appeared in English 2 years ago called Bergoglio's List. It's Schindler's List. And it's $15, and you can get it on Amazon, and it's written by an Italian journalist who went around and interviewed a lot of the people who have survived. Some of them are still in Italy, some have gone back to Argentina. He was named Archbishop of Buenos Aires by Pope John Paul II in 1992, and then a cardinal in 2001. But as a bishop, he lived very simply in Argentina. He had a little apartment, no servants, cooked his own food, drove around in an old beat-up French Peugeot car, and most of the days he would take the bus to the office and just sit on the bus next to people and talk with them. And then on the weekends, after he would say Mass, he would go out into the slum areas and just walk these dirt roads and these little shacks and just talk to people. How can we help you? How can the church assist you? Is there anything you need? He did this just as second nature all the time. He felt most comfortable with the poor. Those were the people he felt were his community. He was elected Pope in the March of 2013. In the first consistory in 2006, when they chose Benedict, his name was circulating. They knew him. And they knew he was a very simple but very holy man who lived a very gospel life. And his name was on the list. And he kept telling bishops, no, Cardinal, no. You vote for that other guy. You vote for Ratzinger. You know, he knew the Pope better and all this stuff. So he wasn't elected. But by 2013, things were bad. I mean, the church was in a terrible state. The whole priest scandal was blowing wide open in so many countries. Not only had priests abused children, but bishops had not faced their responsibility. They moved them around, feeling we can't scandalize the faithful, so we won't tell them that Father so-and-so has problems. We'll send him to a new place. And of course, it just kept going on and on. And it was the secular world, not the religious world, that blew the lid on this. And they were really showing the corruption within the church. Many bishops were living very wealthy lifestyles, especially in Europe and the United States, with $1 million and $2 million residences. The Vatican Curia, the bureaucracy, they were full of rumors about what was going on, about the corruption of money, about the ambition of people trying to jockey for position to become closer to the Pope and to get power. The Vatican Bank was receiving a lot of criticisms because it was so secretive in its dealings. And there were strong feelings in Italy that it was laundering money for the mafia. So even the cardinals knew they needed something different. And so he was elected in March of 2013. And if you recall, the first thing he did when he came out on the balcony, he wasn't wearing the beautiful ermine and the gold rings. He came out in a simple white cassock with a wooden cross. And his first words were, "Pray for me." A very simple man who knew that he was a sinner like everyone else, and he wasn't here to rule, he was here to serve. He directed the Vatican to open and create free showers, haircuts, and meals for the homeless of Rome. And if you Google Vatican showers, I did it again yesterday, you'll see all the pictures of these very nicely constructed showers, and you'll see people who are homeless coming in. They can get food, and he goes down and has lunch with them. Regularly, every Wednesday, he has lunch with them. Sometimes he'll invite them into his own little apartment. He doesn't live where popes live in the Vatican. He lives in a boarding house where he lived when he was at the meeting that elected the Pope. He liked it there, so he stayed there. And he lives with some retired priests, nuns, lay people. So he has a little community. He goes out regularly and walking the streets. He appointed an outside commission to investigate the Vatican Bank with outside economists and people who have nothing to do with the church. And the bank is worth about $10 billion. They have closed 900 accounts already that appear very shady. And now we'll have regular outside audits, because that bank is supposed to be taking money from churches around the world and channeling it to the poor in developing countries and to the missions. And so he says he wants it to be an ethical bank by making it transparent in all its dealings. He is trying to make sure that priests or bishops who abuse children are removed immediately. He has removed some bishops from authority for either being very bad in their handling of the child abuse situation, or for living too lavishly. He removed the Bishop of Bling, as he was called, in Germany, who was living, he just spent $6 million to renovate this palace. He's out. He's told all the bishops of the world to live simply, to feel the sufferings of the poor. And the words he's used is, you have to smell like the sheep if you're going to be a shepherd. They didn't like that. He wants all bishops and priests to act as fathers and brothers who are meek and merciful with fellow Christians. And he's declared a year of mercy starting in December, where he wants the Catholic Church really to act in a more merciful way to everybody, no matter who they are or what sin they've committed. About 3 weeks ago, he issued a call to all Catholic churches and convents, monasteries in Europe to take refugees from Syria and North Africa. And the Vatican has taken in a few families itself in its small 2-mile square territory. Within months of his election, he sent a special message to Muslims of the world when they ended their 30-day fast in August of 2013. And this is what he wrote to the Muslims in August of 2013. Turning to mutual respect and interreligious relations, especially between Christians and Muslims, we are called to respect the religion of the other, just like Francis and the Sultan. We're supposed to respect the teachings and the symbols and the values of other religions. Particular respect is due to religious leaders and places of worship. How painful are our attacks on one or other of these. Regarding the education of Muslim and Christian youth, we have to bring up our young to think and speak respectfully of other religions and their followers, and to avoid ridiculing or denigrating their convictions and practices. When he received the first diplomatic corps credited to the Vatican a week after his election, this is what he told the diplomats. It is not possible to establish true link with God while ignoring other people. It is important to intensify dialogue among various religions, and I am thinking particularly of dialogue with Islam. At the Mass marking the beginning of my ministry as Pope, I greatly appreciated the presence of so many civil and religious leaders from the Islamic world who attended his first Mass in Rome. With these words, I wish to emphasize once more the great importance of dialogue and cooperation among believers, in particular Christians and Muslims, and the need for it has to be enhanced. Now, when he was in New York 2 weeks ago, if you recall, he went to Ground Zero, and with him there were leaders of major religions of the world. And they engaged not only in a dialogue, but in a prayer service. And what they prayed for is that the use of violence in the name of the divinity stop, and that religions of the world work together for peace. He then traveled up to St. Patrick's Cathedral that afternoon, and it was packed, absolutely packed with people, and particularly the bishops, clergy were all up front, the women were in the back. And he's up there, and the Cardinal Archbishop of New York is there, you know, with him, right there, Cardinal Dolan, you know who he is. And the first thing he says out of his mouth on the altar isn't, "Thank you, Cardinal Dolan, for inviting me. Thank you for this beautiful church." First thing he says is, "Let us pray for our Muslim brothers and sisters who have just finished their month-long fast and who are now engaged in their annual pilgrimage to Mecca, where there has been a stampede." Because you get 3 million people going on that Hajj pilgrimage. And the stampede had killed over 700 people. He says, "Let us pray for them." It was silent. I would just wonder what was going through the minds of these clerics. That's the first thing he mentions. And by the way, Cardinal Dolan had spent $175 million to renovate the cathedral so it would be in good shape for the Pope. "Francesco, go and repair my house, which you can see falling into ruins." Who interpreted that correctly? Then and now. In July, he issued an 84-page encyclical on the environment called Laudato Si, and those are the first words of Francesco of Assisi's Canticle of Creatures. "May the creatures praise you." And those are the first words of the Pope's encyclical. And he cited in the encyclical Francesco as a model person on how to love and respect the environment. Like Francesco, he called it a serious sin to pollute the environment because it is our common home. So what do we conclude? Much more could be said about these two Francises. A Hindu or a Buddhist would smile and say, "This is a proof of reincarnation." There it is. How can you argue that? Muslims are so pleased that they have found another interlocutor to dialogue with peacefully, as Francesco did with the Sultan 900 years ago. Now, Confucius, he would just stroke his beard and say, "People are still practicing my method of deliberate tradition. Learn from the wisdom of the past, but apply it creatively today." So those are the two Francises. So what do you think? We have time for a couple of things. Is this on or not?
I don't think I can keep it. There's a hand mic.
The hand mic, yeah. I have this on. Oh, that's it. Is this working now? Nope. Oh, I used the hand mic. Are there any comments or questions you'd like? We have a couple of minutes.
I want to first of all thank you for that. That was absolutely wonderful. I've been thinking since Pope Francis has arrived on the scene that I think we are really singularly blessed to be living in a time when we have, I think, possibly two of the world's greatest leaders. We have Pope Francis and Barack Obama. And the two of them working together, I think, is a very hopeful sign. Thank you again.
How do you respond to this comment we heard the other day at a restaurant? The Pope is a socialist.
Well, you know, Jesus was too. I mean, and so was the Buddha, so was Gandhi. I mean, when you talk about responsible use of material wealth and trying to find a way to distribute it fairly, we call that socialism. Another way to talk about it is healthy capitalism. If you really want a capitalist society that's going to function, you need to take care of people so that they can be producers and they can be consumers. I think it's good capitalism to have the income distribution that we're experiencing gap in this country right now is widening. And it not only hurts the middle class and the working class, it hurts capitalism. It really does, because people will not be able to consume. But I think all the major religious traditions of the world feel that the use of wealth is so important. Jesus spent more time warning against the misuse of money than he did against the misuse of sex. That's a fact if you read the Gospels. And yet when you think of some sermons today, pastors have reversed the priority. Sex, 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 sex. And they just won't talk about money. So the fact that the Pope is talking about the responsible use of money and the evils of unlimited capitalism, I think is a moral necessity. People to dismiss him will try to use the word socialism, which sound as a dirty word. I mean, liberal is a dirty word too today. Why is that? Because the spin doctors have made those words bad. There's nothing wrong with liberal or conservative in their true meanings. So it's used as a way to dismiss him. But I think he's right on in terms of talking about the things he's talking about. And he's not alone. I mean, as you point out, the president is talking, Bernie Sanders is talking about it. By the way, when the Pope and the Congress talked about Dorothy Day, this great, American, the Congress, who's that? Bernie Sanders. I know who Dorothy Day is. She was a socialist. That was, Bernie knew who it was. So there are people who have worked for that, So it's not bad. The European countries are democratic, socialist democracies. They have far more government regulation and distribution of wealth than we do, and yet they get along. They're not communists. They don't repress people.
I always used to wonder how the Italians managed to be capitalists and communists at the same time, but they managed it somehow.
I like the story for all ages that you chose, and there was one spot that stood out in my mind where the fox says, "We're not getting anywhere with our quarreling," and my immediate thought was, nobody ever does.
That's absolutely right.
At a former employer, they had the president had a management style of managing while walking around, and when you were talking about him being with everybody, on the bus and wherever else, it made me think of that.
If you watched his face while he was here, his face lit up the most when he was with children and people who were suffering, people who were physically challenged. When he was with the diplomats, he was polite, but he was much more comfortable with people in the street.
He did seem to have fun with Obama, though, and they were doing a little hand jive kind of thing at one point. It was really fun.
Incidentally, just to clarify something, after he left, there was this story that this woman from Kentucky, named Davis, she claimed, and her lawyer claimed, they had a private meeting with the Pope, and he said to her, courage, and he confirmed what she was doing. The Vatican has cleared that up the last couple of days, if you've been watching. The papal nuncio invited dozens of people to come to his residence in Washington to give the Pope a send-off before he left for New York. So there were, maybe 40 or 50 people. And there was a crowd. And it was just meant to, say, we're wishing you a safe trip to New York. And apparently the nuncio on his own, unbeknownst to the Vatican, invited this woman to be part of the crowd. So she was part of the crowd, and the Pope just went through and just shook hands like this. Nobody got personal attention. The only personal audience he had while he was in the nuncio's house was with two gay men whom he had known for years from Argentina, and one of them is a chef now in New York. And before he came to New York, he called the guy on the phone. He said, Giuseppe, I really want to see you, my old friend. I think it was one of the students he taught. So he invited that guy and his partner and gave him a big embrace in the papal nuncio's house in Washington, not the Davis woman. So just to clarify, because her lawyer lied about it, the lawyer last week was showing pictures of these crowds in Lima, Peru that were demonstrating for Kim Davis. And it was a lie. The pictures were taken months ago about some other issue. So the guy is not very credible, and he's been trying to spin it that the Pope has been giving her all this attention, and it's just not true. So anyway.
if I recall, the conservative American bishops had called Paul Ryan's budget immoral. Do you think that he and the other powerful Catholics in D.C. will be influenced at all by Pope Francis?
No. No. I quoted Karl Marx. Money affects the way you think. Paul Ryan is a very sincere man, and he really thinks that if we could just get more tax breaks for business, you're going to get more jobs for people. That is absolutely